Today, what we're looking at doing is we're looking at covering learning outcome 3 on infectious diseases, the unit that we've been studying. And we are going to be looking at today, going forward from what we covered last time, which was looking at how diseases are transferred by vectors or carriers. And we looked at different forms of carriers, and obviously we looked at a table in terms of how different types of pathogens actually can carry the, infection, or basically carry the, let's say, bacteria, virus, fungi, protozoa, different types of cells, which can then cause infections in human transmission, or the vectors essentially using the process of what is called transmission to be able to carry infection and then infect individuals with different types of diseases. We talked about microorganisms, and we also talked about macroorganisms. So micro means which are not visible to the naked eye, and macro means organisms that you can see with your naked eye, things like ticks, flies, fleas, ticks, and certain types of worms which can affect the human body. Now, in today's learning outcome, we are moving on from understanding, after we understood what is pathogen, what are different types of pathogens, vector-borne diseases, which are pathogens essentially transferring diseases to humans or other mammals, and this is primarily through the process of transmission. Today, we are going to go into understanding how the body first line of defense against infection diseases and transmission happens. So, what are the cells? What are the type of let's say reactions or chemical reactions which happen in the body, which essentially prevent the spread of infection, and how does your body fight infection is what we're going to be looking at studying in today's learning outcome. So a couple of things in the learning outcome, which is what it focuses on, which is to understand how does the body provide the first line of defense. What is the first line of defense in terms of human body, and how does it prevent or fight infection? The second thing that we are going to be looking at is that when the infections do transmit and it leads to illness or some sort of symptoms begin to be shown, then how do we treat that infection and that illness, finally going into a full-blown disease? And that could be through the process of vaccination and medication. So we look at understanding benefits of vaccination. So there are two assessment criteria that we are looking at covering in this. One is looking at body's non-specific defense mechanisms against pathogenic, infection. This is a key term. So we are going to be looking at non-specific defense, pathogenic reactions which are caused in the human body. And the second one would be how vaccinations can lead to artificial acquired immunity against certain infectious diseases. Now, this particular bit is going to be related to also your assignment, part B, which is going to be a controlled examination. And in that controlled examination, it is going to give you a scenario. And in that scenario, what we are looking at understanding is how does your body acquire artificial immunity through vaccination. So these are the two assessment criteria that we are going to be looking at covering today in Learning Outcome 3. Now, in order to discuss this, let's start with a couple of things on the Learning Outcome 3. Let's look at first how infections spread. So this is a bit of a recap in terms of what we've covered so far in Learning Outcome 1 and 2. So before we understand what is the body's reaction or what mechanism does the human body take or put into place to fight infections, we need to know how do infections actually spread. So infections are actually spread through 6 key stages. And these stages are basically defined as what are called chain of infection. That means these are series of steps which have to go through, or the human body has to endure and go through before we say that you have had an infection. And these stages tend to be that, an harmful pathogen, which could be a bacteria, virus, fungi, protozoa, or a type of cell which has basically started giving you an allergic or some sort of a reaction. And that basically starts the process of what is called infection, because your body gets infected. Now, your body also provides a conducive environment for the pathogen to multiply. That means, let's say a protozoa or a bacteria would infect your body because they see conducive conditions available for them to thrive. That means either your body's immune system is weak, or in some cases, it finds conditions which are going to be useful or conducive for it to start multiplying. So when we look at athletic foot, which is caused by a fungi, normally damp surfaces, uncleaned and unhygienic, use of say socks and boots essentially provide conditions for fungi to grow, and that is what causes the fungal infection. Then what we also need to know is that there should be a carrier available for pathogen to move. So when we get infected, most infections go into our bloodstream, with the rarity of some of them being on the skin. But at some stage, the infections travel down to the bloodstream, from where they are able to flow into the body. So there is a transport available for it to spread into the body of the host. The route which the host takes into the body, to enter, would be essentially generally through a carrier or a vector. Like in the case of Anopheles mosquito or mosquito in Aedes mosquito, we see, encephalitis or a bite of a mosquito essentially ends up transferring the protozoan into the bloodstream of the animal. And in that case, that causes the infection. So the route tends to be through a carrier or a vector, which basically would then, provide the pathogen a route to latch onto the body. We see anthrax, I gave you an example of last time, which is where, fleas or flies essentially sitting on the cows are able to transfer infection. And when humans eat that infected beef, which is, infected with the flies, then in that case, the transmission of that virus happens, and that leads to a full-blown disease called anthrax. So there should be a route which the pathogen should have to be able to enter a human body. Then the route which we look at, which allows the pathogen to enter the body, also provides an exit route. Sometimes what happens is we see we get infected. So, for example, I'm having a bit of a cold, a bad cough, and what is happening is I'm having a bit of strepsils, some sort of, let's say, Benadryl, which is a syrup, and they are obviously helping me get over, the viral infection that I've had for throat. Now, at some stage, what will happen is my body mechanism would start to kick into place and would overpower the pathogen, or in this case, the virus. And what will happen essentially is that because my body has become immune and has now developed the immunity to be able to repel this particular infection, the virus would tend to, in order to survive, would tend to jump to another host. So in my case, I got this throat, infection from my daughter because she picked it up in school when she had a bit of medication and cocodamol and, strepsils and, some of the syrups. That has allowed the thing to get weakened, and I picked it up. Now, obviously, from my point of view, if somebody else picks up this in my family, then obviously this shows that the virus which is causing this throat infection is actually able to jump from one host to the other. Because if it feels that it is not going to be able to survive, then at some stage the survival instinct kicks in, and the virus then tries to jump to another host to be able to get the same conditions of thriving, and obviously, being able to multiply and obviously stay with the host. The last part tends to be when you look at the pathogen enters the body of another person. So when it jumps, when we look at chicken pox, I am pretty sure that a lot of us have had kids, and if one child gets the chicken pox in the family, then we normally isolate that person. But even after the isolation, we do tend to see that sometimes if the other children have not had the chicken pox, then they would also get it, even in spite of all the isolation and precautions that we have taken. And this tends to happen because of the transmission. And here the pathogen will enter another body or another host, and that is where they will cause the infection. But in our case, the beauty is that some diseases that we get them only once in life, and then the body is able to create what is called its own immunity, and this immunity then remains with us for life. So this is how generally we see 6 broad steps in terms of how infection typically happens, in a host or in a human body. Now, with that understanding, what we also want to be able to do is essentially understand that what are the, so if I put another slide in, what I want to do is basically talk about what is the body's first line of defense against infection. So this is the main headline of our, what do you call, learning outcome. So what we also want to be able to understand is that just from a knowledge point of view, just from, let's say, curiosity point of view, what we also want to understand is what is the first line of defense in human body as far as infections are concerned. So when we talk about different types of cells, we have heard about red blood cells, or RBCs as we call them. Have you heard about the red blood cells? We've got white blood cells, WBC as we call them. We also have what are called platelets. Have you heard about these terms? Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets? Now, we also look at within the human body, when we look at the first line of defense, we then talk about, say, for example, immune system, which basically, is the system which is the kind of first line of defense as far as human body is concerned. This immune system basically fights. So this immune system could be the skin. Obviously, the skin has hair on it, and the hair follicles and the secretion which the hair follicles do, they basically make sure that the skin is not getting infected, against, any sort of, say, germs or infections which could try and enter the body, human body from outside. So when we look at this, skin tends to be the first form or first line of defense as far as human body is concerned. But when we look at moist environments like our mouth and, say, for example, our eyes, we look at our ears, there are environments in which obviously there is, the intense, let's say, the routes available for the pathogens to enter the human body as well. So your ear secretes earwax, which basically keeps any sort of dust or germs or, any sort of parasites out. When we look at our mouth, our saliva has what is called antibiotic properties, wherein it is able to basically mix with any sort of food or anything that we are having, and it basically neutralizes that. When you look at your nose, you have nostrils, and when it warms the air, the hair in your nostril typically would block any sort of filter any sort of, let's say, foreign body trying to enter through the nasal route. So there are various ways through which our body looks at first line of defense. But when we talk about the immune system, there are certain types of cells. So certain types of cells within our white blood cells, within our platelets, which primarily would be cells which will form the first line of defense against any sort of infection or pathogen which is trying to infect our body. Now, they tend to be called what are called B cells. Now, B cells produce what are called antibodies, and these antibodies, so certain type of cells, I would say B cells, and they produce what are called antibodies, which basically fight against the infection. So when we are given a vaccination, just jumping ahead slightly to give an overview here, when we are given any sort of medication or when we are given any sort of vaccination, then in some cases, sometimes in order for our body to develop immunity, what we have to do is through vaccination, inject what is called antibodies into our body, and that then start multiplying to provide immunity or say provide the first line of defense against the infection that is trying to harm your body. So when we talk about these kind of cells, B cells are cells which primarily produce what are called antibodies. The second type of cells that we look at, which we need to be aware of, is cells which are called the T cells. These T cells are cells which are basically called killer cells. They will go and kill the infection. They will go and try and neutralize, let's put it this way, the infection which is trying to spread in your body. Now, they might do it in different ways. They can encompass the infection and then excrete it out. They can directly fight the infection. They can overpower the infection which is being caused by a foreign body, and they would then do this through release of any sort of chemicals which would neutralize the spread of infection which is happening in your body. So when we look at different types of cells and cells which basically form the first line of defense against infection in the human body, we talk about the B cells, which basically produce antibodies, and T cells, which are called killer cells, which basically try and neutralize the virus or any other foreign element like bacteria or protozoa, and they would do so by looking at some sort of a chemical reaction, and they help in stopping the spread of infection. When we use vaccines, what we try and do is, so when the body is being given a vaccine, what is a vaccine? Vaccine is basically introducing, if I put it this way, an antigen into the body. And this antigen would, this antigen which is, introduced in the body will work with B cells and T cells to neutralize the infection or the, say the microorganism or the pathogen which is causing that infection. So sometimes, and a clear example of this that I would give it is the COVID-19 vaccine, because the human body in most cases did not have any sort of, exposure to this kind of an infection or virus. Previously, the body had to be given an injection through vaccination, and that vaccination was basically antigen which was introduced into the body, the antigen being the dormant, or the treated, protein, which primarily helped develop the immunity, and that immunity was developed by this particular dormant antigen, allowing the body to produce a certain type of B and T cells which could fight and neutralize the COVID-19 or COVID-19 virus in the human body. So COVID-19 vaccine or vaccine essentially is a good example of how a dormant form of antigen is, or a virus in this case, because it is a virus, it was introduced in the human body to basically help in the development of immunity within humans against the COVID-19 virus. Now, we won't get into the details in terms of how these vaccines actually work, but there could be lots of different ways in terms of, defending the human body against pathogens which could be causing diseases. And these diseases could happen primarily on the skin, the mucus, the cilia, and, in any different forms of the external, environment of the human body. But what we are looking at essentially here is trying to look at learning and understanding ways in terms of how the body defends against the pathogens, which are basically disease-causing organisms. And these could be essentially, organisms which are trying to enter the human body either through the skin, through your mucus lining, through the cilia, or microscopic hair, which are, debris that we have within our lungs, which is through the nasal route, and also other types of, barriers that the body would have to defend against itself in the first place. And if the body does get infected, then what we do is the natural response or natural mechanism through which the body defends itself against a bacterium, a virus, a parasite, or any sort of a fungus which can cause a disease would be made up of different types of reactions which the body would undertake. And in those cases, depending on the severity of the pathogen which is trying to enter the body's reaction would be either mild, severe, or very severe. And that would then be looking at producing what is called antibodies. And antibodies are formed from what are called antigens. And these antibodies, which are produced in response to a pathogen which is trying to enter the human body, would be the first line of defense in the body's immune system. So here is what we want to understand, so just as a overview, that how does the body defend itself when we talk about infections. The body defends itself through the immune system. The immune system comprises of different elements. But when we look at going into a bit of detail, the immune system actually produces what are called antigens. These antigens then produce two different kind of cells, which are called the B cells and the T cells. The B cells produce antibodies, which will fight the reaction, and the T cells basically are the cells which will go ahead and actually neutralize the virus or the pathogen which is trying to multiply in your body. And that is what generally forms the first line of defense when we talk about human body in general trying to fight infection. Is that okay? Is that clear? Any questions on this so far?
It's clear, sir.
Okay. Now, the other bit that I want to look at is, before we go into some of the assessment criteria, we also want to understand that how does the body provide the first line of defense against infectious disease transmission? And what are these infectious diseases, and how do we look at our body's immune system? So one of the things that I would also insert a slide here and mention would be, let's look at the immune system. So in our human body, there are different types of immune system. One is called the innate immune system. Now, when we talk about the innate human system, this is basically the body's first line of defense. So when I say innate, what is the meaning of the word innate? Innate basically means that you have something which is existing in your body. That means you have an immunity which is built into your body from birth. And this is going to be something that you have, as we call it in biological terms, this is native immunity or immunity which you're born with. And this is something which your body, would try and fight with at the first instance when it looks at having some sort of, say, pathogen attacking it. So this is also going to be, when I say innate immune system, and I talked about, what are the various organs or barriers that would fight this. One will be skin, mucus lining of your nose, your lungs. You would be looking at, for example, mechanisms which are primarily going to be physical barriers to infection trying to, or the pathogen trying to cause infection in your body. So in this case, when we talk about innate immune system, this is something that you're born with. There is a first line of defense which is available in the human body, and this would be generally, dealt with from as physical barriers, and this would generally be what is called your skin, your mucus, your cilia, and any sort of other initial hurdle or obstacle which the body would provide, which would not allow the pathogen to enter your body. So when I talk about the example of earwax, when I talk about saliva in your mouth, when I talk about the nasal lining, the nasal hair in your nose, when I talk about, for example, the secretion which your eye does, tears when sometimes we get, these are body's reactions to allow the body to fight the pathogen from a physical perspective or a physical barrier perspective. And that is where I would essentially say that these tend to be, innate immune mechanism or systems present in the body. Then we also talk about what is called the adaptive immune system. Now, what is adaptive immune system? Adaptive immune system comes into play when we do see the innate defenses being breached. That means physical defenses have been breached. That means if I get a cut on my skin and blood starts oozing out, that means the physical barrier, which is the skin and the skin lining that we have, is got punctured, and that would not be then safeguarding us from getting an infection. So adaptive immune system would be when the physical barriers of immune system, which is skin, mucus, cilia, other forms which are going to be physical barriers, are breached. That means they have been neutralized, and in those cases you would generally then have infection being or the pathogen being able to enter the human body and cause infection. Now here in this case, the adaptive immune system consists of when your body starts fighting it through B cells and what are called T cells, because then in this case the pathogen has entered your body or entered your bloodstream. So when we look at B cells and T cells springing into action, what we would see is that they would start producing what are called antibodies, and the antibodies would try and neutralize the pathogen and the infection which it is trying to cause. And the combination of B cells and T cells starts to then limit the spread of infection by killing the infected cells at the source. And this part of how your body tries to fight the infection through the immune system then provides a much more targeted and a specific response. So if a cut happens in your hand, the transference of your B cells, C cells, the antigens, and the antibody production increases where the cut has actually happened, because it is trying to seal that off by a barrier, by creating a barrier and ensuring that the infection or the infected cells are killed and the spread is not allowed to happen. And that is where you would generally find adaptive immune system kicking into place, wherein the physical barriers or the innate immune system barriers have been breached. The third way that we look at, getting your body to work against the pathogens would be through vaccination. So here, vaccines would be important because they would be helping your body to get what is called induced immunity. That means your body at the first instance either is unaware of the infection, is unable to fight the infection, and is something new as an environment that they've seen for the first time. And obviously the reaction to control and spread of that infection tends to be much, much slower than what could be anticipated if the infection or the pathogen was known to the human body or the body in terms of which is it's trying to infect. So in this case, vaccines would essentially introduce what is called a harmless version of the pathogen, which is what I normally say is a deactivated protein, either an RNA or a protein of the actual pathogen, which would allow the body to create what is called an induced immunity. So this injection or injection of the harmless version of the pathogen into the body exposes the adaptive immune system to produce what are called memory cells. So this is a bit of a process that we need to know. So what happens in this case is, if I look at it, introduces an harmless version of the pathogen, and that is why vaccines are specific. One vaccine cannot control all sorts of infection. So there was a specific vaccine created for COVID-19 virus, wherein the innate version of the inactive version of the virus was injected into the body, and that allowed the body to actually start creating what is called adaptive immunity. So adaptive immunity leads to the production of what is called memory cells, and these memory cells, as the name suggests, they remember the pathogen, and that enables the body to have a quicker reaction or response, let me say a quicker response rather than a reaction, to the pathogen trying to cause or spread infection in the human body. So here, vaccinations then are basically training the human immune system to defend against any specific disease without actually causing the illness. So these are three different forms of immunity the body would have, the human body would have, and they would develop innate being. If I summarize, the immunity that you're born with, that means something that you're born with and your body is aware of. Adaptive immunity, wherein the body, physical defense mechanisms fail, and the pathogen is seen to be breaching these physical defense mechanisms, where the body then produces what are called antibodies. Antibodies then, along with the specialized B and T cells, essentially neutralize the pathogen or recognize that an infection is being spread in the body, and they tend to neutralize, kill the infected cells, stop the spread of the infection in the body. Now, sometimes the body does not have immunity. So in this case, what we look at is we look at vaccinations, which are basically in, let's say they introduce what is called the, say, passive form of the pathogen into the body, or an harmless version of pathogen into the body. And that then kicks in the adaptive immunity process by producing B and T cells. But before B and T cells are produced, it also produces what are called memory cells, which remember the pathogen. And as a result, this leads to the production of B and T cells, which then can fight the infection at any given point in time when the body is exposed to it. So you might get COVID-19 virus for the first time, you get the vaccination, after a point in time you get well, but then your body starts to develop immunity, and it has memory cells which will determine and remember that this kind of a virus infects the body and causes this reaction. So next time when you're exposed to the COVID-19 virus, your body might have a lesser reaction or a mild reaction to it, because your body is able to produce the using the memory cells that has stored the information. It is able to produce the B and T cells quickly to gain immunity, and that is where your reaction, your body's reaction to exposure to again the COVID-19 virus, minimizes or becomes mild, and you do not get infected. And that is a way through which the body then looks at developing what is called immunity, but that is primarily induced immunity, which means your body would be given some sort of an inactive version of the virus or the pathogen which is causing it, and that would then allow it to start the process of immunity itself in the body. Is that okay? Is that clear? Now, with this, we go into some of the assessment criteria with the understanding in this background. So when we look at the first one, it talks about evaluating it talks about evaluating the body's different non-specific defenses against infection. So what we've understood so far is basically defenses which body has when the pathogen enters the body. Now, what are the defenses which your body has, which are, non-specific against any sort of infection? So sometimes, to give you an example of this, when we talk about non-specific defenses, excuse me, non-specific defenses against pathogen, when we are talking about, barriers which are going to, be present on your body, but these barriers would essentially show some sort of, reaction to the infection or the pathogen which is trying to infect your body. But these reactions would be mild or would remain at the surface of your body itself. They might not enter the body, or these reactions or infections might not enter your body, and they would be killed off by your physical, barriers, or innate immunity barriers, as we call them. So when we talk about non-specific defenses, it includes what are called, the biological term called, anatomic barriers. And it is also called, so when we talk about non-specific defenses, there are different types. So one is anatomic, the other we talk about is inhibitors, the third tend to be, say, for example, phagocytosis, and the fourth tends to be, symptoms that you get to see of that, what you're trying to get illness of, things like fever, inflammation. And these are type of reactions which your body will show when we talk about non-specific defenses against pathogens. Now, when we talk about specific defenses, in specific defenses, we will talk about, adaptive immunity, which is basically through antibodies and through vaccination. So when we look to differentiate between non-specific defenses and specific defenses, we need to be very sure that non-specific defenses are defenses which are going to be classified under what are called anatomic barriers and as inhibitors. And when we talk about specific defenses, they are going to be adaptive immune system and vaccination. Now, if we look at these in a bit more detail, what are anatomic barriers? Anatomic barriers would be, which I've mentioned, but the biological name when I talk about is, when we talk about skin, our mucous membrane, and which lines our airways, whether it's nasal, mouth, or wind airways. And when we talk about hair, here, whether because hairs on the skin, on your scalp, on your eyes, eyebrows, eyelashes, in the nasal lining. So when we talk about hairs in general, they, along with your skin and your mucous membrane, they act as what are called physical barriers that prevent pathogens from entering the body. Now, these barriers would be termed biologically as what are called anatomic barriers. Now, they create the first line of defense against any sort of infection which is going to try any sort of pathogen which is going to cause an infection in the human body. Now, so when we say non-specific defense barriers, what do we mean by that? The term that should come to your mind straight away should be barriers that we are talking, which are going to be physical barriers or anatomical barriers, and they would be skin, your mucous membrane, your hair, and any sort of external barrier which is going to prevent the pathogen to cause infection in the human body. Now that we know what are non-specific defense mechanisms or barriers that prevent infection in the human body, we need to understand that how are these pathogens going to then transmit disease from one host to the other. So when we talk about transmission of disease means that it is going to travel from one person to the other. You can get that disease when you come in direct contact with the person. And direct contact, when I say, is by touching, by kissing, by say for example using the same say for example clothes or utensils or any sort of commonly used I would say things which could have germs or essentially remnants of infection that could lead to some sort of disease by direct contact. And it can also be through any sort of skin to skin contact and sexual activity. So when we look at STD or sexually transmitted diseases, they generally tend to happen or get transmitted because there is a physical contact which has happened between two humans or two different animals. Now, indirect spread of diseases can happen by using what is called contaminated objects. And these could be utensils. It could be the use of, for example, toilet seats. It could be used, for example, of any sort of medical equipment, syringes, and they could also cause indirect infection. One of the most common ways through which indirect infection is caused is through persons sneezing. So sometimes when we stay, having a conversation and you do see that the other person, when they are speaking, you also see sometimes, the saliva from the mouth or, that kind of, that is why you maintain an appropriate distance. And the distance is primarily you don't want that contact, which is barriers or ways through which indirect infection can happen. And that is where you would be standing at a bit of a distance so that your nasal airways or, the air that you're breathing is, if an inhaling and exhaling, would not be causing any sort of infection with the other person. Because sometimes infections and pathogens use what is called air as a channel. And that is why these diseases which are caused by pathogens through the route of breathing the same air or exhaling the same air are called airborne diseases. We have waterborne diseases that we looked at last time, but there is also a term that we will look at maybe in the future, which will be termed as airborne diseases. That means they travel through the air, and that will be primarily so when we talk about, when we talk about the high amount of pollen during certain summer months in the UK and people having hay fever or allergy to or some sort of a reaction to pollen, high levels of pollen content in the air, they tend to be what are called airborne diseases because they are entering your lungs or your body essentially through breathing as a process. So when we talk about non-specific defense mechanisms, we need to understand what would be the ways through which the pathogen would be trying to infect the human body. And that will be person to person. And when I say person to person, it will be direct and it will be through indirect, if I put it this way, indirect, ways. And that would essentially be through common objects or objects which are contaminated, and that would essentially be the place where the human body starts to get an infection. Now, going into a bit more detail, what I also want to do is talk about what are called common spread vehicles. Now, this is where when we talk about common spread vehicles, what we are meaning is that how does the virus actually, or how does the pathogen actually travel? So when we talk about the definition of common vehicle or common vehicle spreading the transmission, what we are referring to is transmission which can happen through a contaminated source. And this could be food, medication, some sort of intravenous fluid. It could be equipment which has been used, and it could also include, say, for example, things that surfaces or things that can retain infection if they come in contact with somebody who is already infected with a pathogen. So when we talk about common vehicles, we also see that sometimes when you go to the fields, it is important that if you've stepped on any sort of foreign object, then it is important for you to come in and obviously wash your hands off and obviously sanitize yourself, because when you are up and out and about in the natural environment, there are ways through which you spread say for example you step on fecuses or fecal matter or degrading biological matter. Then in those cases you can carry the pathogen externally on your shoes or on your any sort of say clothing, and that when it gets an opportunity to transmit from one of your clothing or your external wear, it can transmit to the human body. So that is why proper hygiene needs to be maintained, and these then tend to fall under what are called the common vehicle transmission routes for pathogens. Now, we talk about vector-borne diseases. Vector-borne diseases tend to be diseases which could be carried by different forms of carriers, and they would then be infecting the human body when a bite or a transfusion or bite happens, and that is where when the parasite, for example, in the case of mosquito, is trying to suck the blood, but then in return it will transmit the larvae of the virus, and that would then cause the infection or the disease in the human body. It can also happen by, so again, this is basically a bit of classification when we talk about micro and macro. So when we look at bed lice, when we look at lices or ticks in the human ear, they are visible to the human eye, and obviously they could also be causing infection, but they would cause it through the route of bites because they are external and they are on the skin, or they are going to try and cause and grow and cause infection on the skin or the mucous lining of the human body. Now, when we look at these non-specific barriers, what we also need to understand is what are these non-specific barriers and where does the body's immunity system kicks in. So this particular image that we talk about actually highlights the non-specific barriers that we are discussing, and I've mentioned in a couple of slides before. So when we talk about non-specific barriers, which are going to form the first line of defense against the infection or the pathogen, are going to be, external to the body or maybe outside the body, and they are going to be innate. That means something that you're born with, or the immunity which will be essentially present in your body because it is something that you're born with. So when we talk about ears, the mouth cavity, trachea, and bronchi, which is the inner lining of your ear tube. We talk about stomach. We talk about sexual organs like vagina. You look at anus, urethra, which is part of the excretory system. You look at skin, nasal cavity, and eyes. These are all going to be non-specific barriers which your body would use to fight the infection. Now, one of the things that we generally see and get advice from the council and the local government during summer months is that they try and advise us not to go and swim in open water bodies or water reservoirs. And this is because simply in water, you have E. coli and some of the deadly form of bacterium which can, actually go into the human body. Now, when you are in water reservoirs and obviously swimming in waters which have not been treated properly, rivers, for example, or canals, then these waters can have different bacterium, viruses which are present, and they can get onto the human body if you go into without proper, body gear or any sort of protective covering. Now, when you ingest, say for example, when you go and have a swim in the ocean, and if your body immune mechanism is weak, there is lots of different types of infections that you can get on your skin and within your body, and that tends to be the case wherein it is advised that you do not go and enter into these bodies if you are already feeling weak, or for example you are susceptible to getting infections in such locations. Now, your body's physical barriers or external barriers then prevent the spread or the latching of the pathogen trying to latch onto the host. They are these barriers which will primarily prevent it from, having, let's say, preventing the pathogens to basically cause infection. Now, E. coli and other kind of bacterium can enter your human body through anus, through your mouth, and obviously then it leads to severe symptoms of diarrhea and dysentery. So in some cases, what we tend to do is we tend to avoid these places because they are seen to be as infected. They are not, essentially conducive for the human body. That is why you get this warning that you need to stay away. So human body has what are called non-specific barriers and a system to prevent infections from prevent pathogens from affecting infections into the human body. And they tend to be external barriers or innate barriers. And this is a list of what we need to know and be aware of when we talk about these. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Right. Now, when we go into specifics of understanding adaptive immunity and we talk about these different types of cells in the human body, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So when we look at, red blood cells, what is the function of red blood cells in the human body, in the blood? Any idea? Any idea in terms of, so red blood cells are basically cells which carry oxygen and help in the exchange of carrying of oxygen and help in the exchange of oxygen with, carbon dioxide within our lungs and throughout the body. So they would carry oxygen and basically provide oxygen-rich blood and then carry, the carbon dioxide from other cells, which is produced as a result of a lot of activities which these cells are doing, and they would then be going out through the lungs. So the exchange of, oxygen and the carbon dioxide produced in the body or other forms of gases typically does happen through the exchange of RBCs actually being able to carry, say, for example, oxygen to different parts of the body. Now, when we talk about the functions of white blood cells, what are the second type of cells that the human body has is called white blood cells or WBCs. Now, white blood cells are basically they are the basic building block of our immune system. And these are also called leukocytes. The biological name for these are what are called leukocytes. Now, leukocytes are basically, warriors which are present within our bloodstream, and they attack any sort of pathogen like a virus or a bacteria which is trying to enter the body and obviously has entered the body and is trying to cause infection or any sort of disease. So when we talk about white blood cells, they are the cells which are called warrior cells, biological term leukocytes, and they would be looking at basically fighting the viruses, bacteria which have entered the human body. Now, when we talk about the third type of cells, we talk about platelets. So when let me go into a bit more detail on white blood cells. So when we talk about white blood cells in particular, what we are looking at is we are also talking about the white blood cells, of being different types, and they would basically destroy the pathogen through different routes. So when we talk about white blood cells and when we look at the different types, they would essentially be, looking at, let's say, neutralizing the infection which is being caused by a pathogen. Now, in most cases, white blood cells are produced in the bone marrow. Where are they produced? If somebody is going to ask, sometimes you hear the term that a patient needs a bone marrow transplant. The reason why they need a bone marrow transplant is that the body has lost the ability to be able to produce white blood cells. So bone marrow transplant is normally done to initiate the process of the body producing white blood cells. So white blood cells are produced within bone marrow, and 60 to 70% of white blood cells which are produced, in the body, they tend to be, what are called granulites. So they are one type which is basically called granulites. Now, these granulites, along with when we talk about, the other types which are there, neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, would be basically looking at, fighting the foreign body in your, or foreign material or foreign body, or a pathogen, as I call it, in your body. Now, granulites further are divided into three types: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, and they form 60 to 70% of your white blood cells in the body. Now, neutrophils engulf and destroy bacteria. Eosinophils kill parasitic worms. Basophils prevent inflammation in your body, because an infection or a pathogen is trying to cause an infection, and that infection would be a reaction. And if that reaction is going to be an inflammation or some sort of physical sign shown by the body, of the body fighting the virus or the bacteria, then in those cases, the basophils will fight and prevent inflation of cells to happen. The second type of white blood cells are called agranulocytes. Now, agranulocytes typically produce what are called lymphocytes, or basically these are cells which are produced in the lymphatic tissues of the body, particularly in our thymus and in our spleen and the lymph nodes. Now, they comprise 20 to 30% of the white blood cells. So if I mention this here, 20 to 30% of WBC, and these are 60 to 70% of the WBC. Now, these lymphocytes are the ones which actually produce what are called the B and the T cells. So the B cells, which produce antibodies, and the T cells, which are the killer cells, they will produce and fight the infection or the pathogen which is entered your body. And then the second type of agranulocytes are called monocytes. They are the ones which engulf and destroy pathogens and can be present in the body, and specifically in certain locations within the body, to prevent infections which can enter through the physical barriers. So monocytes are going to be more visible in the human body in these places wherein the physical barriers prevent the pathogens to enter the body. And they would then engulf and destroy the pathogen straight away without having to, create antibodies or killer cells to be able to fight it. Now, when we talk about the third type, and I would want to include, what are platelets. Excuse me. So when we talk about the third type of cells, which are called platelets, these are basically cells, and their primary function, is to prevent and stop bleeding. Now, when we look at, and as I mentioned earlier, if you get a cut on your finger or cut on your hand or anywhere in the body, and the blood starts flowing or coming out, that shows that there's a physical puncture which has happened on your skin. Now, platelets are the cells which are going to try and repair the blood vessel which has got ruptured. So why does your blood why does your skin, or you see your blood oozing out, is because a blood vessel on your skin where the bite has happened or the cut has happened or where you've got an injury has basically been ruptured or punctured. And in this case, the body sends, when the blood starts flowing and the blood vessel gets ruptured, the central nervous system sends a signal to platelets, which are the, let's say the cells which basically will go and travel to the injured area or the injured part of your body, and they would then try and prevent the bleeding, stop the bleeding, and that would be done through forming some sort of a barrier. So normally what happens is they would quickly come in, start multiplying, and what they would then do is basically start producing cells which will then form a clot, and platelets would then be responsible for formation of blood clots at the site of injury. So how does it stop the flowing of or oozing out of blood? It stops it by forming what is called a blood clot, and this blood clot is basically formed on the outer layer of your skin, which is called the endothelium. I don't know how many of you know the structure of the skin, but generally this, when we talk about the structure of the skin, so in the structure of the skin, if I just try and see if I can bring image on structure of a simple, diagram of a human skin. So if I show this as a example, just give me 1 second. Let me bring something which is a bit more clearer image. So if you see the, say for example, if you see the structure of the human skin has 3 layers. You have the first layer, which is called the epidermis, which is the outer layer. Then under the outer layer, you have what is called the dermis, which is where all your blood vessels, nerve endings, and things like that are there in the skin. And then you have the hypodermis. So when we talk about the function of platelets, the endothelium or the epidermis, which is the outer lining of your skin, typically where is the place where the blood clot is going to be formed. And that blood clot, which is formed on the exposed layer of endothelium, which is the inner lining of the blood vessel in the epidermis and the dermis, would essentially form the clot, and that would be plugging or basically sealing the wound in order to not have excessive bleeding. And this process of sealing essentially would be forming the clot first. Now, once the clot is formed, the second process which starts with the platelets is called thrombosis. Now, after the clot is formed, platelets essentially create a process or undergo a process called thrombosis. Now, thrombosis means that this is where the blood clots which has been formed within the blood vessels, they will now look at creating a delicate balance between preventing excessive clotting, which is called thrombosis, and ensuring that the clot which has been formed is only needed till the time it can create or replicate the layer which is required to essentially heal the skin. And this part of the process is also done by the platelets. And the third part, which is basically the platelets, which, the cells essentially prevent the bleeding. And what they do is they aggregate and stick together at the site of injury, thereby reinforcing the plug so that even if you move your hand or your finger and these physical movements do not break that particular barrier and the blood clot is stabilized, it remains there. And this process through which it starts the process of healing the wound and maintaining the vascular integrity of your blood vessel is going to be the part wherein the platelets would come in handy, and they would consider, and this is the work that these cells would essentially do. So if I were to ask you what are the 3 different kinds of cells in the body, you should be very clear. There are red blood cells which carry oxygen and help in the exchange, of material within the human body amongst different organs. And that is, their main function. We look at white blood cells or leukocytes, which are basically the warrior cells. And within white blood cells, you have different types. And the third type of cells tend to be the platelets, which essentially, would be normally looking at forming a clot. And through the process of thrombosis, would then prevent bleeding happening wherever there's a cut or a physical injury which happens to the human body. So when we talk about non-physical barriers or non-specific defense barriers which the human body has that fight infection, they tend to be these barriers through which the human body would essentially prevent the pathogen from entering the human body and causing an infection. Is that clear? So this is the first assessment criteria. Is that okay? Any questions so far? Okay. Now the second assessment criteria that we are looking at basically talks about explaining how vaccinations can lead to artificial acquired immunity against certain infectious diseases. Now, this is an important part because if we go back to what we discussed in terms of different types of immunity, we talk about innate immunity, we talk about adaptive immunity, and we talk about an immunity which is basically induced into the human body through the route of vaccination. So vaccinations basically help the human body get what is called artificial acquired immunity. Now, this is something just to quickly refresh. So when we talk about the immune system, vaccination is a route through which the body can acquire adaptive immunity. So these are the two kind of immune systems: innate, physical barriers to preventing pathogens from causing infection, something that you're born with, and adaptive, when you have the infection in your body, the pathogen has entered your body, and in this case, the body would then produce various kind of reactions, use different types of biological and chemical reactions to control the spread of virus, minimize the spread of infection, and that would be adaptive immunity. Within adaptive immunity, sometimes the human body needs to be given an inactive version of the virus or bacteria for the body to be able to generate memory cells, and these memory cells would then produce, if the human body is exposed to that virus or that bacterium, then the human body will produce what are called antibodies. Antibodies will produce B and T cells, and these would then be stopping the spread of infection or neutralizing the pathogen which has entered the body. Now, with that understanding in mind, what we are talking about is vaccination is a way of producing active immunity to the disease in a host without developing the disease. And this is done in accordance with vaccination, which is administered to any human or, say, for example, under any such situation. And one such situation that we look at is basically talking about, the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this case, what we do see is that the vaccination which was developed for different age groups, and people were given this vaccination, and obviously the body then produced what is called acquired artificial immunity. And next time when people were exposed to variants of COVID virus or COVID-19 virus, then the body did not have the severe infection. And in some cases, some people did not even have any sort of infection at all because the body was able to develop acquired immunity because of the inactive version of the virus being inserted into the body, thereby helping the body and the memory cells to remember that if this particular virus enters the human body, then the memory cells then start producing what are called the B and the T cells, and they would then neutralize the reaction, the infection caused by the virus or bacterium or in this case, a pathogen in the human body. Now, when we talk about the acquired immunity, what we also need to look at is a concept called humoral response. Now, this is sometimes also called the antibody-mediated response, which the body actually produces. So when I talk about immunity and and response, what we are also talking about is what is called the acquired immunity, and this, when the body acquires it, is called the humoral response. This sometimes is also referred to as what is called the humoral immunity. The reason why this is called is because this is the body trying to develop immunity against the pathogen, because inactive or a harmless version of that has been introduced into the human body, and this is called antibody-mediated response. Now, this involves the B and the T cells, and they would basically recognize the antigen or the pathogen which is circulating in the body or in the blood, and that would basically start the production of what is called the memory cells. And these memory cells then immediately recognize that this is the pathogen which is causing the infection, and they would then essentially allow the body to adapt to creating what is called an acquired immunity. Now, when we talk about acquired immunity, and in terms of immunity, which is basically the body developing this because vaccination has been given, it then allows the antibodies to be produced, or in some cases, when vaccination is given, they would normally give the antibodies which are required to deal with that particular, virus or bacterial infection. So in the case of COVID-19, the antibodies which were in part and parcel of your vaccination allowed them to, when they were injected into the human body, and if the human body was exposed to this virus, memory cells were activated. They activated the antigens, and the antigens started producing the antibodies to deal with the COVID-19 virus. And this process through which the T cells or the B cells essentially start producing antibodies which are then remembered by the human body is essentially what is called the mediated immunity that the human body develops. So when we talk about let's say humoral immunity or mediated immunity, in this case, what we are basically referring to is the mediated immunity tends to be developed in the human body by T cells. And these T cells essentially would, be the crucial component which will actually create the antibodies. And then these specialized antibodies would neutralize the pathogen and the infected cells. So when we talk about immunity, which is mediated through vaccination, let me insert a slide here. And what I want to do is just make this a bit more clearer. So when we talk about mediated immunity, which the body acquires through vaccination, right, which is i.e. through vaccination, and vaccination may vaccine may insert antibodies which would be fighting inactive version of the antibodies which would be known for a particular virus or a bacterium or a pathogen, and that when injected into the body would essentially create what are called memory cells, and these memory cells will remember what kind of reaction or pathogen actually causes this infection. And if that pathogen or the human body comes in contact with that pathogen, then in those cases the memory cells get activated and they start producing what is called the B cells and the T cells to basically look at producing or fighting the infection in the body. Now, when we talk about acquired immunity, so that is what would be done through the route of vaccination. Now, here, humoral and mediated immunity. So these are two different types that we have to understand when we talk about acquired immunity, which is normally coming through vaccination. So when we talk about humoral immunity, what we are basically mentioning here is it is an aspect of the body's immune system which directly produces antigens. So here it will essentially be looking at producing antibodies, and these antibodies will neutralize the antigen at hand. So let me try and see if I can look at talking about this from a diagram. Give me 1 second. I think this will make it much more clearer. So this particular table that I will insert will actually, differentiate between the immunities that we are talking about. So I think this primarily, hopefully, should be useful because this will, provide all the details that we want to understand when we talk about the concept of, acquired immunity. Now, what we are looking at here is basically if you have to compare the two types of, acquired immunity. One is humoral and the other is cell-mediated or cell-basically mediated immunity. Now here, when we look at the differentiation between the two, humoral immunity basically produces antigens straight away, which will fight the infection. In cell-mediated immunity, there will be no antigens which will be produced. Instead, the T cells which are produced would actually be looking at fighting the infection and, expelling or fighting the spread of the infection in the body. Now, in the case of humoral immunity, B, T cells and macrophages, which are basically another type of cells, which are cells which will essentially be type of white blood cells, and they essentially carry out the function of macro. When we say macrophages, that means they will engulf or encircle the pathogen in terms of covering it so that it does not spread infection. Macrophages are generally seen very eminently in the case of cancer or diseases which spread and become a part of the human body and then spread in the human body. So macrophages are going to be cells which are white blood cells which basically create some sort of an outer covering around the pathogen, and they tend to then isolate that pathogen from getting in touch or contact with other parts and organs of the body, and then stop the spread of infection. So these cells essentially would be engulfing, encircling, or digesting microorganisms by excreting them out of the body, and they would be, part and parcel of what is called the humoral immunity. And then when we look at cell-mediated immunities, helper T cells, which are basically memory cells which are produced, which remember the kind of antigen to be produced if the body is exposed to that pathogen, are going to then create, the B cells and T cells, which will essentially fight the infection and stop the spread of infection within the body. Now, there are other types of cells as well, which are cytotoxic, NK cells, killer T cells, as we call them, which directly attack the pathogen and try and kill them. And there are 3 different types of macrophages as well. So when we talk about different types of macrophages and cells in the human body, there are activated macrophages, which are wound healing, which are called M1. There are what are called activated M2 macrophages, which primarily, also defend against the virus or the pathogen or bacteria. And then there are what are called regulatory macrophages, which are called MREGs. Now, these are further classifications that you don't need to go into, but this grouping is generally required when blood tests and blood samples are done, because what we want to find out is what is the percentage or what is the density of these cells in your blood when blood tests are done. So in order to calculate whether you're a healthy human being and you have a healthy immune system, the counts of these types of cells are done when immunity and immunal responses are being calculated. So that is going into a bit more detail, but might not be required at your end at this stage. But what we want to find out and look at remembering is that when we talk about vaccinations allow human body to get what is called acquired immunity. Acquired immunity can be of 2 different types: humoral immunity and cell-mediated immunity, and they can be compared on different parameters in terms of how they act within the body and how they would essentially be fighting the pathogen and stopping the spread of infection within the human body. Now, sometimes it is important that we also understand that what kind of antigens are produced. If a certain type of antigens increases in the body, that can also be detrimental for the human body, because the antigens start eating some of the other cells or start neutralizing some of the other healthy cells in the human body. That is why sometimes you would see blood tests are also done. Now, What we also look at is that antibodies and cytokines, which are basically signaling proteins as we have in our blood, essentially allow the body's central nervous system to recognize and start creating a defense or a reaction which will basically kick the immune system into place for the purposes of defending and stopping the spread of infection as far as human body is concerned. So when we do talk about immunity, we would look at two different types. One would be innate immunity. The other would be, adaptive immunity. And the adaptive immunity would also include immunity which can be acquired through vaccination. And when we look at that particular route, it is further divided into humoral and cell-mediated immunity. Now, the main part that we want to look at is understand how the vaccination can help us acquire what is called artificial acquired immunity and then help the immune body to fight certain infections or infectious diseases. So here, when we go into details of whether we look at cell-mediated or humoral immunity, we now need to understand what are the different types of cells. So when we look at different types of cells here, like the T cells, the lymphocytes, the macrophages, that is what I've detailed out in this particular slide. Now, to bring it into a bit of a context, what does a macrophage look like? This is an example of a macrophage cell, the diagram of it. Now, this particular cell basically would engulf the pathogen and form some sort of an outer covering around it, and then try and either expel it through the body, through the excretory system, or it basically tries to contain the infection by not allowing it to replicate or grow further than what it creates an encapsulation or an outer covering on in terms of the pathogen's body. Now, they are large cells which originate from the white blood cells. They engulf the foreign material or the pathogen and then basically try and neutralize it by controlling the spread of infection and excreting it from the body. Now, T lymphocytes are cells which originate in the thymus gland of our body, human body. Thymus gland is present somewhere just below your trachea in the throat section of your body. And these kind of cells, when they're activated by the presence of antigen, they would get bigger and replicate into a number of clone cells. These are further divided into four types. First type is called the helper T cells. They are also called the cytotoxic T cells, memory T cells, and suppressor T cells. So when we talk about the T lymphocytes, their main function of the T lymphocyte cells in the human body, specifically within the immune system, is primarily to look at let's say, I'll put it this way in terms of, their main aim or the function primarily is to look at, forming some sort of a covering around the infection or the pathogens, which would primarily stop the spread of the infection within the human body. Now, when we talk about, let me see if I can bring across, a type of diagram to show that. So when an example of this would be like when we talk about T cells in particular or lymphocytes, what we are basically looking at is they are going to be of two types. This is the one that we talked about, the B cells and the T cells. And these cells would essentially, specifically when we talk about T cells, T lymphocytes, they would be looking at creating what are called proteins, which are called antibodies, which will fight the pathogen. So when we in general talk about the function of lymphocytes and in particular T lymphocytes, their main aim in the body is to recognize the antigen which is causing specific reaction or infection within the human body. This recognition is highly important because this allows the T cells to recognize and identify the pathogen and then allow the body to trigger the creation of other types of T cells which will go and neutralize this particular pathogen in the human body, which is causing the infection. Now, when we talk about, different types of T cells, and when we look at, cytotoxic T cells, what we are basically talking about is cells which are going to be directly involved in killing the intracellular pathogen and eliminating them through eliminating the function of they being able to replicate. So if I look at some stage when you get, say for example, if you relate it to an example that, say I'm running fever for a couple of days and it is not going away, so what the doctor then does is gets the blood tested and they find out, yes, you have a bit of an infection, and this would then prescribe you some antibiotics for, say, a 3-day or a 7-day period. So when you have antibiotics, what the antibiotics is essentially doing is they are helping your body acquire what is called, acquired immunity. They would basically start creating, reactions against the infection and try and control it by destroying it. Now, when we talk about this as an example, what the antibiotic might contain would be a type of antibody which is going to go and kill the pathogen. And this would be termed as cytotoxic type of T cell, which is going to stop the spread and mutation or reproduction of the pathogen in the human body. So it will make the immune system strong. It will generate the helper T cells, which will start creating more antibodies in the body and will recognize the antigen. And this recognition through the helper T cells would then basically be presenting what is called the creation of antibodies, and these antibodies will start fighting the pathogen in the body. And this is going to be under the control of what is called the cytotoxic T cells. So these cytotoxic T cells, essentially would be primarily responsible for killing the, pathogen and the cells and stopping the replication of the pathogen's ability to be able to replicate or reproduce, and thereby, eradicating the infected part of those cells through the human body. Now, when we talk about memory T cells, what we are looking at in terms of memory T cells are going to be, function of this particular type of cell is going to that it is going to remember for long-term basis what caused the infection. And if that particular pathogen is to infect the human body again, then these memory T cells will become active and they would create antibodies which will fight the infection within your body. Now, when you look at suppressor T cells, the suppressor T cells are going to be, again, a form of T lymphocytes, which are going to play an important role in the regulation of how your immune system reacts when you are faced against with that particular type of pathogen, and what kind of tolerance your body would produce through the immune system when you're exposed to that particular pathogen again. So going back to an example of COVID-19, a lot of people got infected second time around with COVID-19 as well. But when they were given another dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, the next time when they were exposed to the virus, they did not show or they did show a mild reaction or a very mild kind of reaction because their body had produced enough antibodies and antigens to be able to fight the infection, and thereby the body, became, immune. I would not say totally immune, but became immune to the severe reactions of the virus when they were infected or when they were exposed to that virus for the first time. So suppressor cells, in a sense, are going to be important because they decide and regulate the immune response of the body, and what kind of immune response your body would show, whether it will be mild, severe, or critical, would be dependent on the suppressor T cells essentially, and they would be the critical or vital components of your immune system, which will play a crucial role in maintaining the immune balance and also preventing excessive immune responses when you're exposed to that virus again or that pathogen again. Now, when we talk about the two types of immunity, we also look at what are called humoral immunity and cell-mediated. We also talk about, the B lymphocytes. So when we talk about the B lymphocytes in particular, and we talk about the functions of B lymphocytes in particular, B lymphocytes are basically the B cells. So T lymphocytes are basically the T cells which are produced. So when we look at the biological name, it is biological term, it is B lymphocytes, but they are basically B cells, and they create a certain type of protein which produces the antibody in response to the attack by, or in response to the defense when your body is exposed to a particular pathogen or a foreign substance. Now, when an antibody binds with the virus, what it does, the B cell, when it binds with the virus, what it does is it prevents the virus or the bacterium or the pathogen from entering any other form of cells in your body, and thereby restricting the flow of or spread of infection. So the B cells basically are the important part of your white blood cells or leukocytes, and within the leukocytes, when we look at further classification T and B, they are the ones which are produced in the bone marrow. They are the ones which essentially produce what is called the proteins which lead to the creation of antibody, and these antibodies finally fight the infection in your body, or fight the spread of infection in your body. Is that okay? Now, this particular slide is where I've shown, a diagram of the T cells and how they get activated. So the T cells, when they get in touch with the virus, the memory cells are produced, the helper T cells are produced. They then produce a reaction which starts producing the B cells, and the B cells then basically create the antibody, and the antibodies then, depending on the type of T cells which are fighting the pathogen, which is either cytotoxic or, say, for example, in some cases, suppressor T cells or memory T cells, they would then go and fight the pathogen, and that would then lead to the spread of infection, or the infectious diseases, stopping in your body. They will also then produce and be dependent on, classified on, say, two different types of immunity, depending on if they've been injected in the human body through vaccination. Then they would create what is called the acquired immunity, and acquired immunity which involves the T cells taking the lead to fight the infection would be basically cell-mediated immunity, and in some cases where the B cells essentially take the lead in fighting the infectious diseases in your body, that would be basically leading to, or be classified under what is called humoral immunity. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? So I put some slides in primarily to explain how the antibody and the antigen basically start fighting a viral reaction or an infection, which can essentially enter or cause infection in the human body. So there are some slides which primarily are then created to help explain some of the detailing of non-specific and vaccination-led artificial acquired immunity, for you to understand the second assessment criteria. So these are some backup slides that I've created for assessment criteria 3.1, which is talking about non-specific human defense mechanism against the transmission of infectious diseases. One is for skin, the other is talking about the mucus lining which is present within the nose and stomach. We talk about the cilia, which is primarily small membranes which are present essentially in our lungs, and they would be basically looking at helping in the exchange of oxygen, or preventing the spread of infection, primarily because they would be non-physical. They are going to be physical barriers, and they are going to be a part of the body's non-specific defense mechanism system. Is that okay? Any questions at this stage? So some part of this is quite detailed, and what I would suggest is all you need to do is go through some of the slides that are put together here, and they would explain and go into detailing of what is the main reason of how the human body actually fights infectious diseases by triggering a defense mechanism which is called immunity, and this can be of two different types: innate and adaptive. And then once we look at going into further details, vaccination allow us to get acquired immunity, which can be further classified into how the body fights the infectious diseases into humoral and cell-mediated immunities. And that is where you need to understand the cell structure, different types of cells, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the leukocytes. When we talk about the white blood cells, because they are the ones which fight and produce the protein and the antibody and the antigen, we have to go into classification of these to look at further talking about the different types of cells, B and T cells. And when we in particular go into the breakup of these white blood cells, the lymphocytes, the T lymphocytes are 60 to 70% of your white blood cells. The B lymphocytes, which is the B cells, are about 20 to 30% of your white blood cells. And then further classification of these white blood cells into T cells, into T lymphocytes of 4 types, and B lymphocytes or B cells into 2 types is what you need to understand. And that would help you, master this particular learning outcome. So this brings us to the end of today's session. And I would like to know if you have understood what we have discussed today. If there are any other questions that you have, please feel free to ask me now. So no questions, everything understood?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so what I would suggest is maybe going through this particular part of the presentation, in a bit more detail would be useful to crystallize and, understand the various types of cells and the type of defense mechanism the human body puts forward for the purposes of, fighting infectious diseases. Now, there are one or two websites which I'd like to point out, which hopefully would give you some more knowledge in very, I would say, simple form to be able to read, to update your knowledge and bring up your knowledge in terms of the infectious diseases. So this is BBC Bite Size, which is a website that I put in the references of the presentation. Some part of the content that I've looked at has also come from here. So when you look at the non-specific human defense system against diseases, the part we've talked about, skin, nose, trachea, and bronchi, and the stomach part of it has actually come from here. So my suggestion would be to go to this particular page and look at reading this section or pages which are pathogens, understanding different types of pathogens, what kind of diseases they cause. That would help you bring up to date with learning outcome 1, 2, and 3 in particular that we have covered so far in the infectious diseases. It is about a 10-15 minute read, but they would essentially be very, very useful. And these are things that you'll be able to relate to in terms of what we've discussed during our lectures. And also, they would be useful because it will get you to understand how we look at classification of the different types of cells and the defense system that the human body has when we talk about in the context of immunity. And they would be giving you some additional information from apart from what we have covered essentially in the discussion during our lectures. So we'll meet up tomorrow to discuss learning outcome 4, which is going to be discussing a specific immune system defense mechanism. So my suggestion would be to do a bit of reading after my session today so that you are absolutely clear with what is the immune system, different types of immunity, because tomorrow's discussion is going to be further going into detailing of immune system and how does the human body actually develop immunity against a particular disease or a particular type of pathogen which is trying to infect the human body. So thank you so much for attending, and I will see you tomorrow, same time, and we'll discuss the next learning outcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.